sustainable compliance have really, really have to do with the bargaining relationships and the bargaining powers of industrialized organized labor and workers who are not organized. Without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and turn us to our first speaker. This is Dina Bishara. She's the Assistant Professor of International and Comparative Labor at the School of Industrial Labor Relations. She's my colleague at Cornell University. The paper she'll be presenting is entitled More Relevance, Less Power, Trade Unionism After COVID-19. She co-authored this paper with Greer, who's the director of the ILR Ithaca Collab and Senior Research Associate at Cornell University, and Jeonghun Kim at Cornell University. So without further ado, Dina, I'd like you to introduce your paper.
Thank you very much, Desiree. And so I'll just jump right into the paper. The economic shock caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the lives of workers around the world, while at the same time bringing renewed attention to workers' capacity to organize, mobilize, and fight back. This paper looks at the effects that the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic shocks associated with it have had on the world's labor movement. Recent literature on labor movements has looked at three broad areas of interest. One has to do with the use of innovative strategies, including new forms of organizing and reaching out to other constituencies, the structure of the labor movement, and the emergence of new forms of organization, including worker self-organizing. And third, the building of new power, or how the use of these innovative strategies has affected worker power. And we have the power resources literature that highlights four types of power, including structural, organizational, institutional, and societal power. This paper tries to look at and investigate the effect that the pandemic has had on these three areas of interest for the research on labor movements. To get at this question, we organized a series of webinars from March to October 2020. I'll say more about these webinars and the speakers in them in the following slide. But essentially, we tried to get the voices of labor leaders and activists to understand how the labor movement has responded to COVID-19 and how it's been affected by it. And in brief, participants from these webinars highlighted the need for the labor movement to engage in new strategies. Importantly, some of these strategies that were highlighted were introduced kind of outside of traditional actors like unions. But we also see an emphasis on the use of existing power resources and the use of the existing action repertoire that the labor movement has traditionally relied on, and much less evidence that new power resources were being built. And that's, in a nutshell, our main argument. We see some discussions of new strategies, but not really much evidence for the development of new power resources. So to quickly highlight how we make these claims, the paper is based on a series of 11 webinars with labor leaders, grassroots activists, and academic researchers based in Europe, the United States, as well as in the global South, including South Africa and Bangladesh. We wanted to hear how these labor activists and union leaders reflected on the moment that the COVID-19 pandemic has posed for the labor movement and how the labor movement has responded. The topics varied widely, including the effect that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on unions in the global North and global South, the mobilization of essential workers, racial disparities, unemployment, new forms of mutual aid, global labor rights, and other topics listed here. What we did was we transcribed these webinars and we divided them up into transcripts for each speakers. Then we used a qualitative data analysis software, MaxQDA, to assign codes to various points that were made by the different speakers to systematically get a sense of how these speakers kind of converged on a few themes and what comes out from that. The videos of all of these webinars are available on the Cornell ILR Ithaca Collab webpage, so you're welcome to go there and see the range of speakers we had. So to just briefly highlight our findings, we looked at 4 areas in terms of the effects that the pandemic has had on the labor movements. One area of interest was how the COVID-19 pandemic has offered opportunities for the labor movement. And what we find here is that while the pandemic has certainly offered new opportunities for labor, it has also imposed significant constraints on organizing. And I'll say more about each of these areas as we move through the presentation. Second, we looked at framing and the emergence, and what we see is the emergence of new frames developed by labor leaders and activists around the role of the state, attention to what a new normal would look like, calls for a new social contract, as well as new frames around essential workers, their role and their rights, and concerns about increasing economic disparities, as well as marketization in areas such as healthcare. In terms of the action repertoire that the labor movement has resorted to, we found that a lot of our speakers talked about conventional forms of action, including lobbying and negotiations, but we also see that the pandemic has highlighted the limitations of some of these conventional types of action, and we see that there have been some innovations with regards to the action repertoire by the labor movement. And finally, with regards to power resources, most of our webinar discussions highlighted the use of existing power resources, as well as the need to expand worker power and build worker power. But most of these discussions were aspirational, highlighting the need to engage in building that power. But we see much less evidence that that power has already that new power has been built. So I'll go into each of these areas in a bit more depth right now. In terms of opportunities, we see that many of our speakers talked about the COVID-19 crisis and economic shocks presented by COVID-19 as an opportunity. And it was seen as an opportunity for organizing new workers that were not organized before, or opportunities to reconsider long-held economic doctrines about the role of the state and about austerity. So for instance, just to give you a flavor of what that looks like, one of our speakers talked about the rediscovery of the state, the idea that the state has tools and that part of these tools include using money, which was something that the speaker said was not something that was discussed before. It was taboo in previous times. So seeing the pandemic as an opportunity to envision some of these issues, including the role of the state. At the same time, however, we see our speakers highlighting that the COVID-19 pandemic has imposed important costs on workers and their ability to organize. And we see this most clearly come up in discussions around restrictions and threats to freedom of association, especially in non-democratic regimes, as well as threats to workers and constraints on workers who are not covered by pandemic relief. So we see that many workers are left out of the pandemic relief packages that have been passed in various countries. In terms of framing, this is an area where we see a lot of innovation and a lot of the emergence of new frames around a new normal and around a new social contract. Consider, for instance, this quote from Liz Schuler, the Secretary Treasury of the AFL-CIO, who argues that we must come together to rewrite the rules of the global economy and actually write the story of our future. There's also renewed attention to labor rights, and the idea that without the right to organize, without the right to bargain, the labor movement will not be any stronger. This is according to Shauna Bader-Blau of the Solidarity Center. And finally, new frames emerging around the value and the importance of essential workers, migrant workers, and informal workers, and speakers highlighting the disparities that are being brought to the fore by the COVID-19 pandemic and how these types of workers need to be celebrated, as this quote highlights from the president of the Congress of South African Trade Unions.
1 minute warning.
Oh, okay, thank you. In terms of the action repertoire, we see conventional actions such as lobbying and negotiating, as well as new forms of action such as disruptive actions and emergence of mutual aid. And I'll just briefly end on this slide where we looked at whether any of this is amounting to building of new power. And as I mentioned before, most of the discussions focused on mobilizing existing power resources rather than building new forms of power. There were, however, discussions around the need for the labor movement to become broader and more extended as a social movement in order for it to be very powerful. So this quote wraps it all up, essentially highlighting, and it was echoed by many of our speakers, essentially highlighting the need for labor to build alliances with other social movements in order for it to be strong. I do have, I'll probably leave this as the last slide, but I can come back with a slide summarizing some of the main implications at the end. Thank you.
Perfect, Dina. Thank you so much. We'll do comments at the end, but just to say that that was a fantastic webinar series that Dina and Ian put on. And I don't know if they're still recorded, but if you all in the audience are interested and have the opportunity, I recommend that you take a look. It was really great. So next up, we have Danielle Lam, who's an associate professor in the Human Resources and Organizational Behavior Department at the Ted Rogers School of Management, Ryerson University. She will be joined by Milad Moghaddas, a recent graduate of the Bachelor of Commerce program at Ryerson University. They will present their piece entitled Unions, COVID-19 Risk and Pandemic Pay Premia, Evidence from the Canadian Labor Force Survey. They co-authored this piece with Rafael Gomez. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and hand things over to Danielle and Milad.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity today to present our work. So today our presentation will be covering the following, and we look forward to potentially answering any questions that may come about. So the motivation for this analysis comes from the many news reports of various companies announcing COVID-19 pay raises using terms such as frontline heroes, essential workers, etc. We wondered whether this was simply virtue signaling on behalf of certain companies, or if this was the market mechanisms of labor supply and demand at work, whereby certain employers in particular were forced to increase compensation to attract and retain workers during the pandemic, given the additive risks that are involved. Now, the notion of compensating wage differentials, CWD, which I'll be referring to as an acronym, is foundational to neoclassical economics. If workers are required to endure various risks or otherwise undesirable aspects of a job, employers will be required to pay a premium to attract and retain workers in these occupations. So the more disagreeable the work, the higher the premium. Ideally, compensating differentials should serve to financially incentivize employers to remove or reduce hazards, sufficiently protect workers' health and safety, and otherwise improve working conditions where possible. So empirical studies have found support for the existence of CDs for workers in jobs with undesirable non-economic characteristics. Much of this literature considers CDs in light of exposure to workplace injury or fatality. So it's in this vein that we wanted to explore the presence of compensating differentials in light of the new COVID-19 exposure risk. Just because there is robust empirical support, however, for the existence of CDs, it does not mean that always and in every situation we find them. As we'll show in our study, for some workers in occupations and conditions where we would expect a CD, none is found. In fact, we find examples where workers facing terrible employment conditions actually also have among the lowest earnings. The final element we seek to explore in our analysis is the role of unions in relation to compensating wage differentials. Studies have found that union members typically receive higher CDs than non-union members. The reasons for this might be because unionized workplaces are less sensitive to competitive pressures, where there is a strong union presence, less competition, or significant barriers to entry. So therefore, these firms are able to afford to pay substantial hazard premiums. The collective bargaining process itself gives workers a greater voice where they may explicitly state their preference for safety. Unions, in their role as advocates for their members, may also be better positioned to look for, monitor, and uncover workplace risks and communicate those risks to workers and management alike. And so with that brief background, our study seeks to empirically explore these 5 research questions. And with that, I'll pass it on to Dr. Lam.
Great, thank you, Milad, for that intro. In the interest of time, I'll be very brief, but if anyone would like a copy of the paper, I'll give my email address at the end, and I'm happy to send one out. For the data section, you can read here some of the specifics. I just want to draw your attention to what I think is the most unique feature of the study, which is how we constructed our measure of risk. And it's based on a ranking system developed by Visual Capitalist, who provides scoring for occupations in the American ONET database, which many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with, based on 3 dimensions. So it's this risk score of COVID-19 exposure based on contact with others, physical proximity to others, and exposure to disease and infection at work. They were able to score 966 ONET occupations. We matched those occupations and scores by title to our Canadian version, which is the National Occupational Classification System. And then further match them to the public use files of the Labor Force Survey, which aggregate occupations into 40 broad occupational groups. So this kind of exercise of matching and binning led us with 40 occupational groups with corresponding average COVID risk scores based on these dimensions conceived of by Visual Capitalist. It's not a perfect system, but it makes sense when we looked at the outcome. So you can see a histogram here of the distribution of occupational COVID risk. Most occupations come in at relatively low risk, with a handful of occupations really driving the risk profile. And those are listed here on the right-hand side of the screen. None of this should be a surprise. Our estimation strategy is fairly straightforward. We begin by estimating the probability of being in a high-risk occupation based on a set of observable characteristics. And then we dive into looking at the relationship between high-risk work and earnings, first at the mean, and then for males and females separately at the mean, and then across the earnings distribution using the recentered influence functions by Firpo, Fortin, and Lemieux, excuse me. Of most interest are the interaction terms here that look at the effects of time and unionization. So if there are differential effects during the COVID period, and then differential effects on earnings for high-risk workers. So we'll go very quickly through the results, and then Milad will summarize, and we'll kind of try to pull this all together in a timely way. Firstly, the results of our probability model. Not surprising given what we know about the impact of the pandemic and how it's been particularly burdensome for certain groups more so than others. We find that historically vulnerable workers were also more likely to be employed in a high COVID risk 19 occupation. And this might be driving some of the spread of the virus, and that we find immigrants, part-time workers, females, and young workers are more likely to be in these high risk occupations, high risk for, again, contracting COVID-19. The first issue of a pandemic pay premium. So we find model 3, and I won't get into why, but it's in the paper, is our preferred specification. So that's the one I'll be referring to. We do find evidence of a pandemic pay premium of roughly 5%, controlling for observable characteristics. And looking at the interaction between the COVID period and being in a high-risk occupation, that's not statistically significant. So we didn't find a differential effect for high-risk workers. However, all of this has to be interpreted with a great deal of caution. So that 5% increase in hourly earnings is rather substantial, but we have to bear in mind the changes to the labor supply that were occurring during this pandemic. And just a qualitative review of the pre-COVID, during COVID histograms of wages, we can even see by eyeball a thinning or narrowing out of the bottom of the earnings distribution. So that's a caveat. Interpret that pandemic pay premium with caution. Now, how do workers in these high COVID risk occupations fare? Regardless of COVID, we find, again, looking at model 3, a statistically significant and fairly large, almost 8% earnings penalty for being employed in a high COVID-19 risk occupation. All else being equal, these occupations are relatively low paid. What about the role of unions? So this is really the nexus of our paper. Again, focused on model 3, there is no statistically significant union pay premium. However, if we look at workers in high COVID risk 19 occupations who are covered by a collective agreement, they enjoy a premium of 10.3%. This is a sizable enough effect to compensate for the penalty associated with being in a high risk occupation in and of itself. So what does that all mean? It means that not only are high-risk workers with a union better off than high-risk workers without a union, but controlling for observable characteristics, they also out-earn those in lower COVID-19 risk occupations. When we look at the data models separately for males and females, a similar pattern emerges with a few noteworthy differences. So for males, there is a small union wage premium. For females, there's a small union wage penalty. Interestingly, males in high COVID-19 risk occupations earn dramatically less than males in lower risk work. There's still a negative penalty for females in high risk work, but it's much smaller. Females in high COVID-19, both males and females in high-risk occupations benefit from union coverage, and unionized females in high-risk occupations did experience a small additional premium during COVID-19, as seen by the positive and statistically significant coefficient on the three-way interaction. I know I'm speaking at warp speed, so I apologize for that. I'm happy to clarify anything that's not translating.
But you have 1 more minute.
There we go. Our final slide, the most significant relationship here when we look across the earnings distribution is that for workers who have a union, so who are covered by a collective agreement, unionization actually mitigates the risk associated with being in a high COVID risk occupation at all points on the distribution, but most especially at the lower end. So for those most vulnerable high risk workers, having a union, the top dotted line here really mitigates that earnings risk. So I'll pass it back to Milad to summarize these findings.
Great. So for time's sake, I'll just say, to conclude, our findings show that unions continue their role in providing protection, at least in the form of compensation for workers most at risk of COVID-19. Going forward, the pandemic will undoubtedly have a continued impact on workers and labor relations. Anecdotal, but perhaps a teaser, you have Unifor, the union representing grocery workers in Canada, that have called on stores to reinstate hero pay. That article was dated on April 30th. So it remains to be seen if and how the pandemic pay premiums and specific hazard pay for frontline workers introduced during the pandemic will impact collective bargaining outcomes in the future. And with that, we thank you for your time.
Thank you both. That was an excellent presentation. Now I will turn things over to Dr. Raymond Robertson. Dr. Robertson is professor and holder of the Helen and Roy Roux Chair in Economics and Government in the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service and the director of the Mosbacher Institute for Trade, Economics, and Public Policy. So Dr. Robertson, take it away. You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Got it. Thank you very much. You'd think after a year of Zoom, I'd have it right by now, but okay. So today I'm going to be talking about the effects of COVID-19 on factory survival in Vietnam. And I know that we have a very limited amount of time and it's tough to follow the other two presentations because they were so excellent, but just to give you an idea of why factory level responses are important is that there was a lot of splash being made in the past year about the effects of the COVID crisis on workers in developing countries, and specifically how falling demand had affected those workers. And those effects were happening to the factories. Factories were experiencing falling demand, and that led to lower pay and actually job loss for workers. So what this paper does is it focuses on those factory responses. Did factories actually have to shut down and dislocate these workers? and send them away, or what's happening? In order to focus on that, we're going to look at apparel factories, garment exporters in developing countries, and analyze that relationship between factory survival, labor compliance responses, and factory characteristics in Vietnam, and particularly those that are participating in the Better Work Vietnam program. The empirical results show that it's the least compliant factories, the ones with the worst conditions, that are much smaller and more likely to close. And this is predicted by a simplified, what's called a Milad model in economics. I'm one of those neoclassical economics. So it was fun to see Adam Smith mentioned in the last presentation. That was great. But my argument here is that the results really highlight the importance of thinking about factory heterogeneity, the fact that there's big factories and small factories and good factories, bad factories, in that debate surrounding working conditions, profits, and factory survival and global value chains. So why does factor heterogeneity matter? If you've been following the debate over working conditions in developing countries, you've probably heard statements like this, like, why can't firms just reduce profits and pay workers more, right? Or why are poor working conditions so stubbornly persistent? Why do we have this persistence of these poor conditions? Why don't private audits work? And why do factories resist improvements in working conditions, even if they're associated with higher productivity? So these questions and others can be informed by applying insights to this factory heterogeneity model within garment exporters. So the model is really simple, and I know most of you are not economists and not as excited about this as I am, but the main assumption here is that factories are going to be differentiated by productivity. Each factory is going to be given a different level of productivity, and we can sort those from highest to lowest productivity. Factories have two choices. They can either produce with high working conditions or low working conditions, and they're going to pay for that, right? They face two costs. There's a startup cost just to produce anything, and also a cost and investment they would have to make to install those air conditioners or extra water or other types of amenities, which would lead to improvements in conditions. Now, the other assumption, which I'm sure all of you will probably disagree with, is that buyers, which is the main sellers of apparel that you might think of, you know the names, they're going to reward factories with better working conditions as a result, right? So they're going to try and decide which factories they're going to work with, and they're going to reward the ones with better conditions. And that's a key assumption. So the model has three predictions, and this, I'm going to try and spend just a minute or two on this graph, which summarizes the whole thing, is that there's three outcomes in the model. Firms either are going to close, or they're going to produce with low compliance, or they're going to have high compliance. And this graph shows productivity sorted along this axis from lowest productivity on the left and then higher productivity as you move to the right. The model shows that the firms with the lowest productivity don't even produce at all, right? They're the ones that don't even open, they shut down. And then there's this middle group, which actually for them, it's profit maximizing to produce with low compliance because they're not productive enough to pay for those fixed costs of moving to high compliance. And only the highest productivity firms are the ones for whom it is most profitable to produce with high compliance. So you see that there's this natural sorting of firms in this space, right, based on this productivity, and this mirrors exactly what we see. We see that the highest productivity firms are the largest, they pay the highest wages, and they're the most compliant, as opposed to these other factories here, which are stubbornly persistent in their working conditions. So one weird result that came out of this model when I was playing with it, I was doing some simulations because that's how I have fun. I was just kind of playing around with this, is that if there's a shock to these factories, like a drop in demand that drops the price for apparel overall, you can actually get two weird results. One is that this area here of factories that close expands, right? So these factories which were open, but they had the lowest compliance, they're the ones that drop out and they shut down, and those workers lose their jobs and they have to go find something else. But this other weird result is that this drop in the price of just baseline apparel actually makes it now more profitable for some firms to switch into higher compliance as a survival strategy, which is really pretty weird. So I thought this was interesting. So I thought we'd take that to the data with Vietnam. And the data, again, are using data from Better Work Vietnam from 2009 to 2020. There was 297 factories producing in Better Work Vietnam in 2019. And I used what's called survival analysis, which is an empirical approach, to estimate the characteristics in terms of the levels of compliance and factory level characteristics like size and other things associated with the probability of closure. So that's a fancy way of saying, let's look at who shut down during the COVID crisis. What kind of firms shut down? It's interesting that we see that average compliance actually rises in the COVID period. It actually goes up in 2020, and that's just kind of a teaser fact. This graph over here just shows you the imports that shows that Vietnam's actually a rising and important star in apparel, so it's an important case. So here are two figures I'd like to point out. This is size and closure status. So we compared the firms that ended up shutting down or leaving better work and those who stayed in, right? Those who survived. And the solid line represents the density, the distribution, the frequency distribution of firms that closed, and the dashed line is the ones that stayed open. And it's very obvious here that the firms that shut down in general are much smaller, right? They're generally much smaller than the other larger firms. Larger firms are more likely to survive. But what about compliance, right? What about, are these the workers that have had better or worse conditions? If you actually look at the factories that survived, that's the solid line on top, and the ones that closed is the dashed line this time on the bottom. And you can see that throughout the entire period, those factories that ended up closing or leaving better work were always those low compliant firms. Those are the ones on that margin that I showed you in that figure. So these two results map very closely to the results of that theoretical model. There's a lot of fancy regression results. And now after watching Danielle and Milad, I wish I would have presented some tables, but I didn't. I skipped them to kind of spare you with that. But the main conclusions here are that using these factory level data from Better Work Vietnam over the 2009-2020 period with a specific focus on what happened during the COVID crisis, it shows that the largest and most compliant factories are the least likely to close. So what was happening, right, is that the firms are already doing pretty well and they had these good relationships with buyers were the ones that survived, but the factories on the margin of survival are smaller and less compliant. So the factories that are the least compliant face a large number of challenges that keep them on the margin of survival. So I realize that a lot of you might be thinking, well, that's pretty obvious. We know that big firms are more likely to survive. But my argument here is that a systematic analysis of factory heterogeneity meets all of those sort of preconditions and thoughts that we had about factories beforehand, but it hasn't been applied to this space. We haven't really thought about the implications. And if these implications have strong empirical support in the data, which I argue that they do in the paper, that's kind of the point, is that the other implications that this model has might also be especially relevant. So what I'm really hoping in terms of an advocacy point today is that in this space of thinking about how do we improve working conditions for workers in developing countries, we need to start thinking about factory heterogeneity. We need to start focusing on those factories that are having the toughest times, because those are the ones that have these persistent and stubbornly persistent poor conditions. So without acknowledging the factory level heterogeneity within the global value chains, and especially in the level of developing country producers, policies designed to improve working conditions, like working on audits or these other types of remediation or even regulation like due diligence, might have limited success. And this is an appropriate model for analyzing those. That's basically the entire paper. I wanted to make sure I got in before Desiree even told me I had a minute left. Desiree, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Raymond is, I think, the only economist on the entire planet who can say things like heterogeneity model and not completely lose me. So he has a knack for making something very complicated and incredibly digestible. I just realized I skimmed over it too. So the name of his paper is COVID-19 and Labor Compliance, Evidence from Vietnam. It's an excellent paper. So next up, we have Ting Zhang, who is an associate professor at the Department of Accounting, Finance, and Economics, Merrick School of Business, Carrie Y. Wright Chair, and associate director of the Jacob Franz Institute at the University of Baltimore. Her co-author is Dan Gerlowski, a professor of economics at the University of Baltimore, and Zoltan J. Axe, a university professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government and director of the Center for Entrepreneurship and Public Policy at George Mason University. They will be presenting today on small business and the COVID-19 pandemic, the role of work from home. So please take it away.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. Our paper focuses on the role of work from home on small business performance in the pandemic. My co-author including Dan Gerlowski and Zoltan Arch. The left graph shows a rise in work from home rate, but this rise in work from home rate probability varies by industry. The right graph shows during the COVID-19, there are 60 million hours saved because people stayed work from home instead of commuting. And among those 60 million hours saved, 30% of those hours are spent on working on primary jobs. That is a major reason compared to other usage of those saved hours. Early in 2020, Dingo and Neiman find that 37% of US jobs are possible to work from home, varying by city and industry. And earlier research also shows work from home rate varies by profession. In the COVID, 45% of firms reported with some workers switched to work from home, and over a third believed they will remain working from home. That's from the Bartik report in June. And US work from home rate doubled over 60% to over 60% by April. That's based on the Gallup panel in 2020. And this data also shows 59% of them would prefer to continue working. So we all know that work from home is it's a very popular situation right now, and many of us probably still want to continue work from home, or some would return partially work from home. So therefore, we're wondering how the work from home will impact us. But more importantly, we also see work from the small businesses are suffering from the pandemic. So therefore, we're interested in understanding how work from home related to small businesses. We're interested in work from home and small businesses for a lot of reasons. First, even if work from home is on the rise, but the impact on small business is unknown from previous literature. And neither there's not research study on in the COVID situation how work from home affects small businesses, no matter from theory or the real data empirics. Small business employed about 50% of American workers. Is very important to our economy. However, small businesses in economic crisis are always more vulnerable, disproportionately negatively affected, and financially fragile. And more importantly, teleworking is less frequent in small businesses related to the technology support and the cost. So if small business can help small business perform better, it would help larger business even more. So therefore, our question is, does work from home help small business perform better in the pandemic? This is our theory based on the production function. And after focusing on the variable cost and variable revenue, this is work from home, total cost and total revenue, and this is working in the traditional office. And after rearranging two ratios and analyze all the ratios, we eventually find out working from home is a more rational option for businesses. Based on our theoretical framework, we generated two major hypotheses. Hypothesis number one is business performance. So we believe work from home is associated with better business performance, and that varies by industry. So hypothesis 1A is a higher work from home rate is associated with better small business performance. That's because there's a saved turnover cost due to less commute, less stress, and better work-life balance reported in the prior study. And there is also reported elevated productivity due to less absenteeism. And in the COVID, work from home does keep the productivity up. So therefore, we believe work from home is related to the better business performance. And also, this work from home effect on small business performance would vary by industry. That's because prior study already reported the work from home feasibility, first of all, varies by industry. And also during the COVID-19, industries that are better suited to work from home experience less productivity loss. Our performance measure including operating revenues level and the dummy variable on whether the business experienced disruption in supply chain, whether the business closed, including temporary closure, and the cash flow positions. We use those measures for the business performance mainly because prior study in the COVID-19 already reported 43% of small business surveyed temporarily closed or cited fragile financing with less than 1 month of cash flow on hand. Our control variables including local pandemic, economic conditions, demographic and financial assistance program conditions. Our second hypothesis focuses on the work from home rate and with the stay-home order situation. So we believe after controlling for the local pandemic, economic, and demographic conditions, the work from home rate would not drop after stay-home order ended. We all know when stay-home order started, the work from home rate elevated hugely, right? But we believe after stay-home order ended, the work from home rate would not drop after controlling for pandemic, economic, and demographic conditions. So that's because first, from our theory, we find out work from home is a rational choice for businesses. And if hypothesis 1, which is work from home related to a better performance for businesses, if that's the case, then business definitely have enough rationale to keep adopting work from home. Therefore, even after the stay-home order ended, work from home rate will not drop. And in part of the reason is in the COVID, the fixed cost paid on learning how to work from home, how to telework, and how to coordinate the telework is already paid. And the awareness of working from home is enhanced, and the advantage of working from home that helps overcome organizational inertia and to reflect upon the visibility of business models has been reported. From both alienable and NABI data, and Gallup data, we see there's evidence that people reported larger than 40% and some even 59% of people who would want to continue working from home even after the policy ended. Our empirical models, including 2 major models. To test hypothesis number 1, our dependent variable is business performance measures for different categories, right? And our independent variables work from home rate. And we consider the policy of stay-home order as well as the COVID severity measure, 4 different COVID severity measures, 3 different measures for economic condition, 4 measures for demographics, and 4 measures in financial assistance from the government. And we including the time fixed effect, location fixed effect, and the random error. To test hypothesis 2, which is on the work from home rate after the stay home order. So our dependent variable is work from home rate, and independent variables is after the stay home order ended as a dummy variable. And we of course control COVID on economic demographic conditions as well as time, location, fixed effect, and the error term. So we first adopt the fixed effect cross-sectional time series panel data model. And considering there is a potential for the IAD issue later on, we also used the 2-level mixed effect models. And in addition, we also adopted the fractional logits, mainly because our dependent variable measures are in percentages. For the robustness check, we use different specifications. We also use daily and weekly data, as well as some other statistic, F-test, chi-square, and log likelihood, and so on. The data sources we can pull out from 7 different type of variable from multiple different data sources. using daily and weekly data, well represented national data and state data from the March 20th to November 9th, and including a variety of sources. For hypothesis number 1A, our result does shows higher work from home rate is related to a reduced probability in reduced operating revenue and lower probability in disruption in supply chain and better cash flow positions, indicating all of them indicating better business performance related to a higher work from home rate and after controlling all our other variables. Our empirical model also shows the work from home effects varying by different industry sectors. All the numbers showing in this table are the work from home effects on business performance. And in wholesale trade, retail trade, and professional services, a higher work from home rate is related to a lower probability in reduced operating revenue. But in the construction, health services, and accommodation, a higher work from home rate is related to worse business performance. And we also find out the end of the stay-home order is related to a higher work from home rate. So as this figure visualized after controlling all the pandemic, economic, and demographic effects. Therefore, our study does show work from home helps small business perform better, and work from home is on the rise even after stay-home order ended from our theory and empirics. Relying on real-time data, and we had our own theory, and this is the first paper on work from home on small business performance, particularly in COVID-19. And we see COVID as a potential opportunity instead of a crisis because of creative destruction that expedited ICT platform and work from home learning curve. And this could have huge HR and urban planning implications. After the vaccine, do we really want to relearn work from home since the sunk costs are already paid? And our future study will including 3-digit NAICS code and spatial patterns. Thank you very much for your attention. If any questions, comments, please feel free to contact me. And please stay home, work from home safely.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ting, and thank you for everyone for sharing your papers. I think there's a reason why this panel is referred to as best papers, and I think it's because even though the papers discussed today are at various stages of production, they are all incredibly fantastic, and they shed new light on what's going on in the COVID world and the impact that it's had on various elements of labor relations and employment relations. So just very quickly, I have some comments that I'd like to throw out, the comments and questions. I invite members of the audience to place questions in the comments. We're a small group, so if you'd rather chat directly, feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you if you'd like to meet the authors. But meanwhile, I'll just kind of go and I'll do comments and questions to everyone, and then I'll turn them over to all of you. So my first question or comment is to Dina and to Ian. And with respect to the COVID-19 webinars. Now, I think that your paper did an excellent job in discussing the new labor frameworks and the compelling actions that were taken by the labor movement across the world, right? You had really excellent examples from South Africa discussed in your paper. I know that Dina, you didn't have time to really get into it in the presentation. I don't know if we'll have time now, but your paper really did a great job in kind of discussing this wonderful momentum. But then you hint at a failure, that one of the parts of your conclusions was that there was a failure on the part of labor to build these new forms of power. And you characterized it as a bit of a missed opportunity. It wasn't clear to me, however, what you would have expected that new power to look like. Like what was a good model, or at what point would something would have satisfied kind of your judgment or your expectation of taking the true advantage of the COVID-19? Because I mean, given what they were faced, the stories that you so successfully paint in your picture was an incredibly adaptable labor movement that took COVID-19 in stride and coalesced around it and really protected their members. So what was lacking in these stories that you were hoping to see? So I think having a better sense of what you wanted and didn't find would have been helpful. Again, because you did such a great job in making this labor movement really seem quite successful. My next comment is directed to Danielle's team. So again, your paper also did a great job. You described, and again, it's almost like you're a victim of what a great job you did. So you did a really succinct job of describing the previous literature, and specifically the previous literature that looked at things like differential earnings and associates with trade union membership. So you really made clear that trade union membership has kind of always been associated with better working conditions, better wages, better benefits, better occupational safety and health benefits. But because the literature kind of already establishes that and proves that, your results seem to reinforce a continuation of those findings against the backdrop of COVID-19 risks and wage differentials. But Danielle, even in your presentation, when you introduced us to the results, you opened with, unsurprisingly, here's what we found. So my question that I want to pose to all of you is, well, what did surprise you, right? Like, how are you moving this? How are you using your data to move the conversation further from what it sounds like we could have already anticipated based on the robust literature described in your piece? Turning now to Raymond, your piece is quite provocative, especially for those of us who have been working in the global supply chain and compliance areas. And one of your main results in particular was that there was little to no evidence suggesting that factories responded to the crisis by reducing overall compliance, and that it actually incentivized compliance. This is a striking finding, particularly against the backdrop of other data emerging, including what Dina was just presenting on, where firms have really been rolling back their labor rights protections and kind of capitalizing on COVID in order to deprive workers of freedom of association. Now, one of the things that I really appreciate and respect about you as an author is you are so transparent, right? Like, you made sure in your paper, you said compliance is defined as a lacking of non-compliance, and the lawyer in me really appreciated that. You also noted that your study was limited to firms in Vietnam that volunteered to participate in this auditing scheme. So you had a certain degree of selection bias, but in your paper you say, but that doesn't matter because this paper is just about the compliance scheme. It doesn't go beyond that, so my selection bias isn't a big deal. Nevertheless, those of us really finding your findings very interesting, I was left wanting, right? Given that there's so many obvious differences between compliance of firms that voluntarily subject themselves to inspection and those that don't, haven't you effectively limited the findings of your study quite significantly, right? Because you've already cut out the bad actors. I would have loved to have seen a broader kind of discourse on the typical type of firm and what their behavior is. And in that sense, wouldn't the shock of the pandemic have a significantly lessened impact on these really, really good actor firms rather than the traditional developing country producer firms that I think a lot of us are looking at? You were also looking at factories, that had a dip in demand, right? But what about those firms that were producing PPE? I know that the demand increased. It would have been interesting to see kind of a comparison of those that were producing rubber gloves and those that were producing t-shirts and seeing if there was something different. And then finally, and I just got this from your discussion, you talked about survival a lot, but at certain points you mentioned that the term survival encompasses both those firms that closed and those firms that decided to stop volunteering in this compliance firm. And that to me was very interesting because nobody will, the concern is that the factory is going to close, right? And that the employees won't have work. But what about those factories that just decided to stop being the good actor? Isn't that the very thing that we're trying to capture here? So it would have been nice to have seen that bifurcated so that I could have seen specifically which ones just chose to stop being the good actors. So it would be interesting to hear your comments on that. And then Ting, much of today's discussion has looked, so Ting, I appreciated your presentation as well. Much of today's discussion has looked at power relations and the role of kind of trade union membership and compliance initiatives on the behavior of firms. Your paper looks at the rate of working from home and small business performance. But I could see how that some of these other factors and variables would have come into play in your findings. For instance, the relationship between trade union membership and the business acquiescence to working from home in the first place, the associated relationship between membership and the small business performance. Or could we assume that the small businesses that granted the permission to workers in the first place, even without a trade union, are the types of responsible or considerate businesses that keep workforces happy, ergo making sure that they have stronger productivity in the first place? So in other words, are there intervening factors at place here, and how did you consider those, and how did you control from them? So without further ado, I'd like to turn things perhaps, okay, we have like 2 minutes. Sorry, I talked too long. So Dina, do you have any comments? Maybe we can like quick round robin.
So I'm going to answer your question, Desiree. The background of this is the union revitalization literature, which is written by people who get excited by unions innovating. And the problem is they don't talk about union power enough. And so there's a new kind of bunch of literature about that. And I mean, what we saw was that unions are still good at mobilizing their existing resources, but the problem is that they're in decline. So the question is, well, you know, how can they build new power resources? And that's what we didn't see. And I'll give you an example. So one kind of power resource is structural power, you know, where unions can disrupt a bit of the capitalist economy in order to make gains. You know, we saw union people talk about global supply chains being vulnerable in the pandemic, but what we didn't see was trade unionists exploiting those vulnerabilities to make gains. So that's just one of a few examples of what we're talking about there.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Danielle?
Sure, thanks for your point, Desiree. It's well taken. The first part, I guess, was a sigh of relief that our results did hold up so well in light of a very well long established theory. So that was more like, okay, cool. Good to know. But what was surprising for me was, first and foremost, that the high-risk workers were so low paid in the first place. That was shocking. And then I think what is novel about our paper is that we're quantifying a new form of risk, and it's not novel to us. It's the COVID is novel to everyone, the novel coronavirus, but that we're capturing that in this well-established framework of compensating wage differentials. And I think what actually started out our thinking before COVID was looking at a more multifaceted understanding of workplace risk beyond the typical injury and fatality, which are of course important. But I think there's so many other ways in which workers are exposed to risk that the literature on compensating wage differentials and the role for unions to mitigate and ultimately, if possible, remove those risks is not really, in my view, well established. So that was kind of what we hoped would be the hook in our paper. But thank you for your point. We'll think more on that too.
Wonderful, thanks, Danielle. And as a gender scholar, I would just say it would have been nice to have read more about your interesting finding about the gender differential too. You know, you presented very well on it, but it didn't come across as clearly in your paper. So it would, I say this through bias, but it would have been nice to have seen a little bit more robust discussion there. Raymond.
Yeah, thank you. There's no way I could possibly do justice to your deep insights, Desiree. This is really appreciated, but I will say, I think I may claim a little bit of success because my goal is to get people to think about factory heterogeneity, and all of your questions and points were about factory heterogeneity, right? What about these firms? What about that subgroup of firms? And so I'm going to take your points and focus on them to the extent that I can to really improve the paper. So thanks again. And also I might just say for doing a great job as chair as well. So thank you very much. Thanks,
Raymond. Ting.
Thank you very much for your comments. And I understand when I go through the previous three presentation, I feel the same way as what you mentioned. Yes, I would love to have those variables like the trade union. By the way, most of the companies do not necessarily have the union members. So that's one issue there. This is not, it's across all the industries. But also the more importantly, like whether it's permission or how much freedom they could for work from home. We don't have those variables to control, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I think even saying up front, listen, most of these firms are not represented by trade union. And for those of us who follow the trade union space and then its numbers, that already is a critical data point that, I think would have been appreciated. So I know we're supposed to be closing now, but nobody's yelled at us yet. So if anybody has any other questions or last minute comments before we close, I think you can probably get away with it. No? All right, well, thank you all for sharing your excellent papers today. Ian, did you have something?
Yes, I do have something to say. So in the 1970s, there was a campaign in Germany against working on Saturday, and the slogan was, it was a little child saying, "Saturday belongs to me and my daddy." So I think that LERA needs that campaign. But thanks for the great comments and papers. I really appreciated it.
Thanks to you all. All right, have a wonderful Saturday. Although, hopefully you'll continue to follow these interesting conferences with your children. It's wholesome. And otherwise, have a wonderful weekend. And I hope to see you all around. And if you want to continue sharing your papers, I'm happy to look at them again. They were all really fantastic.
Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day.
Rafael, our plenary is getting ready to start on the plenary stream if you want to join.